Welcome to our continuing journey to our library, commonly referred to as the Bible, in our Christian education program for adults at Winfield United Methodist Church in Winfield, Kansas, called Grace. This week we begin in more familiar territory because we've looked at some basic understandings. We looked at the Hebrew library, we looked at the Apocrypha, and now we look at the Christian library. And this week is going to be just sort of an overview of the 27 books in the Christian library. Now, whereas the Hebrew library was compiled by a council of Jewish rabbis faced with the destruction of the Hebrew nation, with the destruction of the temple. So it was in a time of crisis and maybe eventual extermination that the Hebrew library was created to preserve their legacy and their tradition. Not so with the Christian library, because the Christian library was determined as a consequence of the conversion of a Roman emperor to the Christian faith, and therefore the Christian movement was the official religion of the empire. And once it became official, it was determined that, hey, we've got to be clear what our library contains. And so the Christian library was a result of sort of becoming established, whereas the Hebrew library was determined at a time of eventual possible extermination of a movement. Now, as we consider the difference between the Hebrew library and the Christian library, it's very interesting to note that since 367 AD, when a leader of the church named Athanasius wrote a pastoral Easter letter to the communities of faith in the Christian movement and included these 27 books. Since that time, there's been no serious attempt to delete or add books to the list. Once declared to be official, the Christian library was set in place for the centuries. Whereas the Hebrew library clarified the legacy of the past, the Christian library provided a foundation for the future. Let me repeat that. The Hebrew library clarified the legacy of the past. The Christian library provided the foundation for the future. And whereas the Hebrew library was carefully presented in 3 sections, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, the Christian library didn't have those 3 sections. Whereas the Hebrew library included no letters. The Christian library includes 21 letters. 21 of the 27 books in the Christian library were letters within the community of faith. And so the Christian library is different than the Hebrew library, both in motivation concerning what would be included and the presentation of what was included, and the shift from no letters to almost all letters lifts up, I think, uh, the nature of the Christian library. Now, the Christian library's got 21 letters, 4 messages of the good news, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, 1 book of history, Acts of the Apostles, and 1 apocalypse. And the 350 years that it took for these books to be discovered, written, discovered, and then placed in the Christian library, the Jesus movement was dominated by persons primarily who had a Jewish heritage, and these persons believed that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. On the other hand, there were non-Jews a part of this Christian community. And these non-Jews did not believe that Jesus was the Hebrew Messiah. They believed that Jesus came to fulfill the law and the prophets rather than being predicted by the law and the prophets. But you see, both groups were able to join together, one believing Jesus was the Messiah and the other believing Jesus fulfilled the meaning of the Messiah. And these two groups combined to enable the Christian movement to be strong by the time the new Christian library was established in 367. Now, both the Jews and the Gentiles in the Christian movement developed in cooperation with each other 2 characteristics which emerged over these 350 years, but it created a separate identity for the Christian movement from the Hebrew faith. So in the time period that these 27 books were sort of formulated, there was a growing separation. Let's put it this way. The Roman Empire converted to Christianity, not to Judaism. And so Christianity, by the time the 27 books were named, had created a separate identity from being a part of the Hebrew religious tradition. Now, as this emerged, 2 characteristics emerged in the Christian community. First of all, was a characteristic of a mission mentality. There was a zeal to reach out to others, believers or non-believers, to convert them to the understanding of following Jesus in the life of love. Now you see, the Hebrew nation, the Hebrew people, never had that missionary zeal to convert others to their way of life. But this Christian movement had a missionary zeal, and that contributed to the separate identity of the Christian movement from Hebrew faithfulness. So the first characteristic was a missionary zeal. The second was that followers of Jesus experienced faithfulness in the context of community. You really couldn't be a follower of Jesus out here by yourself alone. It had to be in the context of community. For in the community, the faithful gathered to commune and learn, to be empowered, to face every situation with the gift of love. You see, faithfulness apart from the community was not the way of Jesus. The Hebrew people never had the understanding that faith was dependent upon community. But the early Christian movement developed with that understanding. So these two characteristics became so important in the selection of the 27 books of the Christian library. Life was in the community, and the missionary zeal of agape love is the common thread of the 27 books. And so you see, these two characteristics are a helpful lens, if you will, to look through which the Christian church can be understood as over a period of 3.5 centuries, there was a growing separation of the Hebrew understanding of faithfulness and the new Christian understanding of faithfulness, which included a missionary zeal and dependence upon the community. This is so important because a fundamental truth needs to undergird our approach to the Christian library. You see, the Christian library did not produce the church. The church produced the Christian library. You know the old saying, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, that's answered in terms of church history and the Christian church. Which came first? The church. And the church, looking at itself, produced the Christian library. A community of missionary zeal of and for agape love came first. And the 27 books reflected these two characteristics as resources for the church going forward through the ages. To conclude, I would simply say that the Christian church in 2023 would not be what it is today if it had not been for these two characteristics which set it apart as one of the three major religions of the Western world. A couple questions for your thought and conversation. What's your response to the two characteristics that set the Christian movement apart from the faith understanding of the Hebrew people? Secondly, how is the understanding of these two characteristics helpful in understanding the difference between the Hebrew and the Christian components of our library, that being the Old and the New Testaments? Thank you for sharing our time together.